Hi there! Welcome to the Week 3 lecture for the subject Work Immersion-ICT Animation. For today, we're going to discuss about initiating a project. So under this lesson, we're going to talk about a little bit of an introduction to initiating a project, what a stakeholder is, what is a stakeholder analysis and its process, as well as what is a project charter and a little bit of its parts. So let's have a short introduction on initiating a project. So this is the first of 5 process groups. So around this area, this is where you establish a project. So after it was said that you're going to do it, you're going to have to do an initial planning. So the idea of this initial planning is to determine a few things which would help in the planning stage on the second stage. So what do we do right here? First of all, we have to identify the project object or need. So a little bit of this one is to specify more on, let's say, what are the scope, what is the budget, and all of those things. Next one, we also determine who the stakeholders and the customers are. After that, we also need to figure out who the necessary people are needed for this project, so who will be conducting this project. And then we will also have to commit any initial financial resources. Under this one, we'll have the different tools and tasks. First of all, we'll be determining the stakeholder and the customer. And then we'll be analyzing our different stakeholders through the use of a stakeholder analysis. And then we'll be having a project charter. So the project charter will help jumpstart the second part of our 5 process groups, which is planning a project. So let's start off first with stakeholders. So what is a stakeholder? So a stakeholder are a set of individuals or organizations that are the following. Number 1, they are actively involved in the project. So they are the ones who are actually doing the project, or even sometimes they're the ones asking for creating the project. Next one, these are also individuals and organizations whose interests may be positively or negatively affected during the project execution or completion. So with this one, we tend to have 3 parts of this. So we have the term involved, we also have their interests, and then we also have the term affected. So the term interest is more generalized. So someone who's interested could be someone who's involved and someone who's affected. However, in this case, interest is more of someone who is not directly involved in the project, but their existence or their input would have a significant impact. Whereas for affected, these are the people who aren't necessarily involved or interested in the project, but how this project is going to undergo may affect them. Another one for the stakeholder is that they tend to exert influence over the project as well as its results. So they can do this in a matter of stages, whether they be involved, interested, or affected. So here we have a few examples of stakeholders. So it depends on what project you have. So it may be that some projects would involve all of these ones. Some projects would have not all of these ones. Some projects would, of course, have other types of stakeholders not part of this. So we have the project leader, the project team members, the project customer, contractors to the project. So tendency is that the leader, the team members, the customer, and then the contractors, they tend to be the ones involved in the project. Because without them, the project would not really happen. You also have their product testers and users. These are the ones who are usually involved. Any group affected during the project process, and any group affected when the project is complete. So a customer, this is a specific type of a stakeholder. So these are the individuals or the groups that receives the deliverables of the project. So when we mean deliverables, this is the actual project. So if you remember, a project aims to create a product, or service. So they are the ones who will be receiving the product or the service. Tendency is that these are the people who requested for the project. So they are a special subset of stakeholder wherein they are the ones who are very much involved. So there tends to be types of customers. First one is interior, which is from inside the organization. So these are the type, this is usually seen more in terms of ICT or programming types of projects, wherein the clientele would tend to come from inside of the company or from inside of the organization. For exterior, your client tends to be outside. So a good example of this one are animation companies. So you don't necessarily tend to create your own story for an animation company. You tend to have someone else from outside of your organization create that script or create that idea. So what are the roles of a customer? So these are just a few of them. Number one is to first estimate ultimate deliverables and the project process. So they're going to have to dictate what they want. So what do they want from the deliverables? Under this one, they'll be expecting very specific features, as well as to determine the project process. So how long is it going to take? What's the budget for this one, or what are the different types of scope? Next one is to also provide information about demands and requests. So this is where your requirement elicitation comes in. So they're going to have to give, of course, the information that you need under the processes, under the types of audiences, or any type of information that may be necessary. For example, when you're creating your own programming project or your own system, of course, they're going to have to provide the data of the employees. You're not going to be the one who's going to give the data of the employees. Next one, they also consider and confirm the entire project plan. So later on, we're going to have a topic on project charter, and they are the ones who will be approving that one. They will also consider and confirm necessary changes in the project. So this is more down the line around execution, monitoring of a project. So if ever there are changes due to changes in scope or maybe some unexpected twist of events, they are the ones who will be considering and will be giving necessary changes. In some cases, they are the ones who are initiating changes within the execution and monitoring stage. And also, they take part on the project team when needed. So probably in that company, they have a specialized person. So if it's in terms of programming, they have probably a UI UX person. So they can be the ones who will be looking into the user interface, user experience, or probably in terms of animation, they can also be the supervisor or the director. So what's important for the customer is that this is not for every single customer. This is only applicable if that certain customer has a certain experience on creating those types of projects. So if they're the type of customer who always goes into these types of projects and they know their way around it, especially the technical part, then they can do this one. However, as stated, this is not for every customer. So when you're identifying stakeholders, you have to think inside and outside of the box. So as stated, there are 3 descriptions on how you can identify stakeholders. So these are the number of people or groups that might be, number 1, interested in your project. So this can either be interested in terms of involved or affected. More specifically, they can be involved with the project, so they have a direct contribution on the creation of the project and its deliverables. And the last one is affected by the project. So for this one, when we're identifying stakeholders, those who are affected by the project are the ones who are not so much taken into consideration. So when you're looking into affected by the projects, you have to look into what the project is, what the project will do, and how will that project affect those ones around them. So this is more of after the implementation of the project, which is quite difficult to foresee, however is necessary when you're identifying stakeholders. Next one, we have their stakeholder analysis. So stakeholder analysis is a technique of systematically gathering and analyzing information to determine whose interests would be taken into account throughout the project. So you already have your set of stakeholders. You'll have to look into their information. How are they affected in the project? What is their interest in the project? And then you're going to look into their interests, or how are they going to affect the project as a whole. So what this does is that it helps you enhance the project's chance of success. Because if you don't take into consideration these stakeholders, they may be the people who will hinder or at the same time stop your project entirely. So you have to make sure that these certain types of people, these people who are affected by your project one way or another, will be satisfied, or at the very least, their way of life will not necessarily be affected. So for stakeholder analysis, you have a general set of steps. So first of all, you have to identify all potential project stakeholders. So together with that one, you'll have to look into the relevant information. So for roles, departments, knowledge, expectations, and influence levels. So more of those ones are the people who are involved or interested in the project. For those who are affected of the project, you don't necessarily know their roles or departments. Most of the things that you should know is their interests, their knowledge, their expectations, and influence levels. So you have to know some certain amount of information that would help affect your judgment in your stakeholder analysis. Next one is to analyze the potential impact or support each stakeholder could generate. So we have different types of strategies on how we can determine impact or support, which will be in the next few slides. And then the last one is to assess how key stakeholders are likely to react or respond in various situations. So again, this is more a part of the potential impact or support. For this one also, you'll have to determine as well what you can do for the stakeholder in order to at the very least satisfy them, or as stated, not be affected with any types of changes in creating your project. One of the strategies to analyze our stakeholders is through the use of the stakeholder analysis matrix. So this is a technique for gathering information necessary for the stakeholders. So it would include the following. First of all, the stakeholder. So most of the time, a stakeholder, you would need to have the name as well as the contact information in order for you to dole out the potential strategies. Next one is the stakeholders' interest on the project. So under this one, you can have a more specific type of how they are interested in the project. But to simplify, we can just have the three parts of it, or three types of the stakeholders: someone who is affected, involved, and interested. Next one is we have a classification model. So we have different types of classification models that would help dole out these potential strategies for gaining support or reducing obstacles. So this would determine their influence as well as how much they can affect the project. And then the last one is potential strategies for gaining support or reducing obstacles. So these are the calls to action that we tend to do whenever we have a certain type of stakeholder. So we have here the classification models of a stakeholder analysis matrix. So there are actually a lot of classification models, but the most famous or the most common one that we use is something which we call as the power interest grid. So the power interest grid focuses on the level of authority, or also known as the power, versus the level or concern, or also known as interest in the project. So a stakeholder may have a level of power, so that can either be a lower power or a higher power. And a stakeholder could also have a level of interest. We have a low interest and a high interest. So there are some of the power interest grid that would use more of a numerical system. However, to simplify it for us, we'll just be using low and high. So for this one, how we're going to use it is you'll have to determine the power, and then afterwards the interest, and then the ones right here would determine the intervention that you have to do. So for example, if your power is high and then the interest is high, then you need to be able to satisfy that stakeholder. However, if that stakeholder has high power, however they're not that interested, you have to manage them closely. We also have there, if the stakeholder has a low power but high interest, you have to monitor them. And if they have low power, low interest, you have to keep them informed. So we have here an example of how we can use the power interest grid. So this will be really important later on if you create your activity. So we have here the example. So creating an open world RPG that is based off real life locations. So for example, a lot of JRPGs are under this one. Like the one that comes off the top of my head is probably Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice, or maybe Persona 5. So we'll be seeing off why it's really necessary for the real life locations. But for now, let's look into a set of stakeholders. So probably let's look into, of course, the game publisher. So these are, let's say, the Square Enix, the Atlas people, the ones which are within your organization. These are the people who develop and then actually publish those games. Next one, for JRPGs, they tend to use it more, or they have a bit of a style wherein they use an anime opening, or they tend to have animation cutscenes. So with that one, we'll need to have probably an animation studio. So we can add those ones. Another one is the console company. So the console company, these are the Sony, the Microsoft. These are the types of companies wherein you're going to deploy your system. So your PS4, Xbox. So of course, they're also part of those ones. Another one is, of course, the gamers, the people who will be playing your game. So for these ones, these are the people who probably are dedicated to a certain type of series, which is usually seen in RPGs. And then let's try to add one more. As you can see right here, the RPG is based off real life locations. So we have, I'm going to add here people who are actually living in those locations. So for example, I've stated Persona 5. So Persona 5 is based off, is an accurate representation of Shibuya or Tokyo. So one of the parts there, Yogen Jaya, which is based off an actual part of Tokyo. So a lot of people or a lot of gamers there tend to use it as a vacation spot, even though actual people live there. So we'll have to take them into consideration. So with this one, after you've determined all of your stakeholders, you determine their interest in their project. So again, you just need to have 3 parts here. So either if they are involved in the project, if they are interested in the project, and if they are affected by the project. So let's just simplify it with those ones. So for the game publisher company, of course, they're very involved with the project. So they're the ones actually creating it, the project. Next one, the animation studio. So the cutscenes, the openings that you will have to do is part of the project. Therefore, they're involved. For a console company, this is more interesting because they don't necessarily create the game. They just publish it. So however, the idea of them allowing on their PS4 or their Xbox or their Switch or their PC is really important. So under those ones, they're not really involved, however, they're interested. We also have their gamers. Of course, they're really interested. And then for people living on these locations, they might not really care about the game, but they care about the game being part of their being the location as to where they live. So we have they're affected. So under those, now you have all of these interests in project. Let's look into the power and the interest. So let's do this per row. So under power and interest, we're just going to have either a high power or low power, high interest or low interest. So for game publishers, they tend to have a higher power, and of course, they tend to have a high interest because obviously they're the ones creating the game. For the animation studio, their power is of course high because they're very involved in the project. So tendency is that if the interest is involved, more or less their power is high. The interest may be different, but in this case, the animation studio, let's say that it's high because more or less they're involved. So as you can see right here, for the involved, the interest isn't always high, however, most of the time it is. Next one is for the console company. They're interested. So their power in terms of this project may be high, because if they don't allow your game to be published in the console that you want, of course that's gonna be a problem. So with that one, their power is quite high. Their interest, however, is not really it's not really that high, so we can just say it as low. It's not really their loss if it may not be their loss if they don't get your project as part of their console. For the gamers, they tend to have a high power because they're very interested in it. However, their involvement on the project, or the power that they give towards the project, is somewhat debatable. However, most of the time it's low. So gamers tend to have an opinion, a very strong opinion of what their game should be. However, if the game developers or the game publishers don't really it's their choice whether or not they take these ones into consideration or not. Most of the time, of course, they do. And then for these people living in locations, so they don't really have a lot of power, they don't really have a lot of say, and their interest most of the time is that they're not really that interested. So now you have the power and interest, you can now look into the different potential strategies. So now we're going to look into the power level and then the interest level, and then see it on this grid right here. So for game publishers, they have a high power and then a high interest. So we're going to look at these ones, find the middle point. So their potential strategy right here is to keep satisfied. For animation studio, same as the one previously, they have high power, high interest. So of course you have to keep them satisfied. For the console company, so you have there a high power, however you have a low interest. So with that one, we're going to have to manage them closely. For the gamers, they tend to have low power, however high interest, so it's necessary for us to monitor them. And then people living on locations, they tend to be low power, low interest, so we just have to keep them informed. So here we have other classification models, so they kind of have the same idea with the power influence grid. However, they have different ways of doing so. So for example, we have the power influence grid. So instead of interest, we have their influence, which is the active involvement in a certain project. We also have the influence impact grid. So instead of having power, we replace that with the term influence. So kind of the same, active involvement versus the ability to affect changes. We also have the third one, which is the salience model. So under this one, we have three criteria that we're looking into. Number one is the power, or also known as the ability to impose your will. Next one is the urgency, or the need for immediate attention, and also legitimacy, wherein involvement is appropriate. So as you can see, these are more of variations or deviations from the power impact grid. So the last part of this lesson is the project charter. So the project charter is technically a signed agreement between all involved parties. So under this one, this is a document wherein you're going to see all of the overview information. So once you have already initiated a project, this is going to be your product. So it showcases the definition of the project, as well as it serves as the guide for project activities, especially for the second part of the 5 process groups, which is planning a project. So under a project charter, you have here different types of elements. So there are quite a lot of them. When you will be creating your own project, the output of the initiating a project stage should be this, the project charter. So here we have a format of how it looks like. So basically, it's more of a fill in the blanks kind of thing, wherein you're supposed to place all of the different parts of it. So you have the set numbers here. These are the same parts that we tend to see later on in the presentation. And with that one, let's have a short description of every single one of them. First of all is project purpose or justification. So of course you have the project name and then the names of your team members. The third one there is the project purpose or justification. So what it does is that it's a one-sentence outline which outlines your purpose, objectives, and scope of the project. So as you can see there, it's a simple but precise statement of the project. So it should only be around one sentence or maybe two sentences. So the purpose of this part is, first of all, to provide an understanding of the project and its justification. So why are you doing this in the first place? Second of all is to establish early on the project's general scope. So what are the project scope, product scope, as well as the total scope? And you can also add here some of the deliverables. Next one is to establish the project manager as well as his or her roles. The last one is who reviews and approves the document included. So most of the time, who reviews or approves the document is the customer. Next one is project objectives and success criteria. So these are realistic objectives and measures on how it will be assessed must be clearly stated. So if you remember from your practical research, you have to follow the SMART protocol, which is specific, measurable, acceptable, realistic, and time-bound. We also have here the summary milestone schedule. So these are the ones wherein you're going to have to list down your major tasks. So this can be done in terms of the 5 process groups. So you'll have to list down the initiating, planning, monitoring, execution, and closing stage. And then you have to set them a deadline. Next one is you'll have to identify high-level risks. So risks are situations or events that will negatively impact the success of your project. So with this one, you'll have to determine specific types of risks, particularly those with high likelihood and high level of impact. So these risks are usually found during the execution of the project. However, good project management usually lists them out as early as the initiation of the project. Next one is the summary budget. So this is more on the financial resources. So you'll have to determine how much the project is likely to cost. So for this one, it doesn't have to be a specific type of cost. You'll have to first determine, of course, what are the things that you'll be needing. Like, for example, wages of team members and subcontractors, material costs, operating costs, and then afterwards, you're going to know the overall cost. Of course, this is going to be changed as later on when you're already planning, executing, monitoring, and closing the project. However, this should give you a pretty good idea of what your budget will be for the entirety of the project. So this will also give you a guide on whether or not the project is sticking to its budget. Next one is we have the project approval requirements. So these are different criteria that must be met for the project to be accepted by the customer. So these are the ways on how you can determine if either A, what makes a project successful. Number 2 is who decides if the project is successful. And then the last one is who signs off on the project. So most of the time, who decides that the project is successful is either the client or the customer, and they are also the same people who would sign off the project. Next one is assigned project management, responsibility, and authority level. So this is more for the project manager and determining the responsibilities and constraints. So you're going to have to look into the following. Number 1 is staffing. So what can they do in terms of staffing? Can they hire? Can they fire? Can they reprimand? Can they promote? And all of those things. Next one is budget management and variance. So how are they limited in terms of budget management? Can they approve an additional budget? Could they disapprove any other types of budgets and all of those things? Next one is for technical decisions. Are they supposed to use maybe, Java programming, or can they use PHP for a website probably? And for animation, are they allowed to intervene with the role of the animation director? And then the last one is conflict resolution. What are the things that they can do to resolve conflict? Are they allowed to simply just reprimand, or can they give certain types of punishments or certain types of rewards? Next one is the name and responsibility of the persons authorizing the project charter. So it includes the name, position, and authority of the person who oversees the project manager. So this is basically the boss of the project manager. This isn't necessarily the customer, but this is more within the organization. Like for example, the boss of the project manager. So what can they do? You'll have to determine those ones as well. So for example, they can approve changes. They can determine acceptance variance limits. So of course, they can determine like the scope of your project. They can also determine impact inter-project conflicts, as well as to champion the project at a senior management level. The last part of the project charter is the stakeholder list. So the stakeholder list will determine a list of people or groups that might be interested, involved, or affected by the project. So you just have to determine their names, their contact information, or whether or not they're interested, involved, or affected by the project. So that ends initiating a project lesson. If you have any questions or further clarifications, please don't be afraid to comment on this YouTube channel. You can also message me through my Gmail, through our Google Classroom, and also through private messaging on Facebook. So with that one, I hope you stay safe, you're able to do this, and take care of your mental health. Bye everyone!